The following program is intended for educational, informational, and documentary purposes. This episode is based on publicly available court records, archival reporting, historical sources, and criminological analysis. Some scenes, presentation elements, and narrative sequencing have been reconstructed for clarity and continuity. Every effort has been made to accurately represent events based on the material available at the time of production. Any opinions expressed are for analytical purposes only and do not constitute legal advice or formal allegations. All individuals are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. This program contains discussions of real-world violence and mature subject matter. Listener discretion is advised. Sydney, New Year's Day, 1963. The city was entering a decade of rapid change, socially, culturally, and scientifically. The post-war architectural boom was reshaping the skyline. Television had entered Australian living rooms, and generational friction was beginning to challenge mid-century conservatism. But on the northern edge of the city, along the banks of Lane Cove River, at Fuller's Bridge, an isolated stretch of bushland would become the centre of one of Australia's most enduring, unexplained death investigations. At approximately 9 a.m, two teenage boys, 17-year-old Peter Thompson and 13-year-old Graham Moore, were combing through the thick riverbank bushland looking for lost golf balls from the adjacent Chatswood golf links. Instead, they discovered two bodies lying in a small clearing off on a dirt track. The male was later identified as 38-year-old Dr. Gilbert Stanley Bogle, a highly respected physicist working in advanced research fields at the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation, the CSIRO. The female was identified as 28-year-old Margaret Chandler, a mother of two and the wife of another CSIRO scientist. The scene was unusual, presenting a bizarre paradox to early responders. There was no visible sign of a struggle, no broken foliage, and no obvious trauma consistent with assault. Personal belongings, including Dr. Bogle's still ticking watch, their wallets, and a handbag, were completely undisturbed, instantly ruling out a robbery. Yet their bodies had been partially covered in a highly unorthodox manner. Dr. Bogle with a crude section of old carpet, and Margaret Chandler beneath pieces of flattened cardboard box. At the time of the discovery, police could not immediately determine a clear cause of death, nor could they explain why the victim's clothing was found nearby, neatly laid out over beside their limbs. What followed would become one of Australia's most debated forensic cases, the deaths of Dr. Gilbert Bogle and Margaret Chandler, a mystery that would weave together threads of Cold War paranoia, underground bohemian movements, and a forensic vacuum that challenged the limits of the 1960s science. New South Wales police investigators arrived at the Lane Cove River picnic area and secured the clearing. They quickly realised the investigation would have to proceed without the standard markers of homicide. Early observations confirmed the total absence of obvious mechanical trauma. Pathologists on the scene noted there were no stab wounds, no gunshot injuries, and no signs of manual strangulation or blunt force trauma. The mud around the bodies carried no footprints, other than those of the teenage boys who stumbled across them, indicating that if a third party had been present at the moment of death, they had left no physical trace. Because of the lack of violence, investigators immediately considered multiple possibilities, ranging from deliberate double suicide pact to accidental poisoning, or exposure to an unknown environmental toxin. However, Because no lethal mechanism could be identified on the riverbank, the case became entirely dependent on what the morgue could recover. The unusual positioning of the carpet and the cardboard led investigators to initially consider a more sinister interpretation, that a third person had been present at the scene during or immediately after the deaths. Police theorized that this individual may have covered the half-naked bodies out of a strange, ritualistic desire to preserve the victim's modesty. That specific interpretation, however, would soon become subject of a sudden, conflicting explanation that completely redirected the tracking of the case. To understand how the two individuals arrived at this isolated riverbank, investigators were forced to reconstruct the exact timeline of the preceding evening. On New Year's Eve, 1962, Dr. Bogle and Margaret Chandler attended a crowded social gathering at the Chatswood home of Ken and Ruth Nash. Ken Nash was a commercial accountant, and his home that night hosted a vibrant, high intellectual gathering of academics, scientists, and professionals. Later commentary has sometimes associated elements of this specific milieu with what later became known as the Sydney Push, a loose left-wing libertarian countercultural movement operating in Sydney from the 1940s to the 1970s. The Push openly rejected conventional mid-century morality, advocating for free love, progressive philosophy, and open relationships. While some of the party's guests moved within these radical bohemian circles, historical records indicate that not all attendees were formal members of the group. Throughout the night, witnesses reported that Dr. Bogle, who attended the party without his wife, and Margaret Chandler spoke for extended periods, isolated from the broader celebration. According to verified witness accounts, both later left the house party together in the early hours of January 1st at approximately 1:30 a.m. Margaret's husband, Dr. Jeffrey Chandler, was present at the party and witnessed their departure. In accordance with the progressive, non-possessive social codes of their intellect circle, he raised no objection, assuming Dr. Bogle was simply going to drive his wife home. Instead of heading directly to her residence, Dr. Bogle steered his 1951 Vanguard sedan towards the Lane Cove River picnic grounds. This was known as a local lover's lane. They were last seen leaving the Chatswood home together. What happened in the dark hours after they left remains the central unresolved question of the case. Post-mortem examinations were conducted at the Sydney morgue under intense public scrutiny. Pathology teams prepared for a standard chemical screening, expecting to find a lethal dose of common mid-century poisons like arsenic, cyanide, or heavy barbiturates. At the time, forensic toxicology was significantly more limited than modern standards. Pathologists tested for a vast range of known commercial and agricultural toxins. The results were baffling. No definitive lethal dose of any known poison was identified in either bloodstream. However, pathologists recorded several highly unusual and alarming physiological findings. Both bodies exhibited signs consistent with acute internal congestion, massive fluid accumulation in the lungs, and deep, distinctive purple-red discoloration patches across their skin. Furthermore, the physical state of the scene indicated that both victims had experienced sudden, catastrophic physiological distress before dying, characterized by violent vomiting, involuntary bowel movements. This rapid collapse forced them to exit the vehicle in a panic, stripping away their soiled garments before collapsing within minutes of each other. The precise sequence of this physiological collapse could not conclusively be reconstructed. While some medical reports describe symptoms consistent with severe neurological or respiratory distress prior to death, the exact progression of events remains uncertain. Importantly, Because no confirmed toxin agent was identified at the time of the original inquest, the state could not forensically prove how they died or if a crime had even occurred. With science unable to provide a definitive cause of death, the media and the public flooded the information vacuum with the dominant anxieties of the era. In early 1963, Cold War tensions were at a historical peak globally, coming just 3 months after the conclusion of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Australia was deeply influenced by international fears surrounding espionage, covert chemical warfare, and defecting scientists. Because Dr. Bogle was a top-tier research physicist for the CSIRO, holding high-level government security clearances, and working on quantum electronics, public speculation instantly pivoted towards an international conspiracy. Media commentary and public theories speculated that Dr. Bogle may have been a target by foreign intelligence services, such as the KGB or the CIA, due to his access to sensitive military technologies. Rumours spread that the couple had been executed by a professional hit squad using an exotic, untraceable military nerve agent or localized lethal gas designed to leave no trace in standard autopsies. New South Wales police were forced to consult with international intelligence networks and Scotland Yard. However, no evidence presented during the investigation or coronial process ever confirmed any involvement of foreign intelligence services, political espionage, or a deliberate state-sponsored assassination. These theories remain entirely speculative and find no backing in the official findings of the inquest. As part of the ongoing homicide inquiry, police systematically interviewed every attendee of the Chatswood gathering, tapping phones and intercepting mail within the scientific community. Naturally, detectives focused heavily on the husband, Dr. Jeffrey Chandler. In a conservative 1963 society, a spouse whose partner leaves a party with another man is automatically treated as the primary suspect. Investigators operated under the assumption that the progressive open marriage philosophy of the group was a front, concealing a classic motive of murderous jealousy. Dr. Chandler was subjected to aggressive, routine inquiries. However, witness statements and official records indicate that he provided a completely consistent account of his movements on the night in question. His timeline was fully supported by corroborating witnesses who placed him at a completely separate party across the city with his own partner after leaving the Chatswood home. He was entirely cleared of suspicion and was never charged in relation to the deaths. Investigators explored an incredibly wide range of possible human explanations, tracking down disgruntled colleagues, former lovers, and local vagrants who frequented the riverbanks. Despite these extensive, far-reaching inquiries, no individual was ever identified who possessed either a plausible motive or the forensic capability to commit the act. No charges were ever laid. During the first few days of the inquiry, the entire logic of a third-party killer rested on one distinct detail: the specific placement of the carpet and cardboard over the bodies. Early investigators considered whether this indicated a deliberate staging of a crime scene. However, just 3 days after the discovery on January 4, 1963, a witness account provided an alternative explanation that stripped the scene of its ritualistic overtone. A local greyhound trainer named John Jack King came forward to police. He explained that he had been walking his race dogs through Lane Cove bushland at dawn on New Year's morning, well away from the main picnic tracks. In the dim, early light, he stumbled across the clearing and discovered the half-naked bodies. Believing the couple was merely asleep after a wild New Year's Eve celebration and wishing to preserve their modesty from other park visitors, King stated that he gathered nearby discarded debris, a section of old carpet, and several flattened cardboard boxes, and placed them over the bodies of the individuals before walking away. This account was heavily examined by detectives, verified, and remains widely cited in secondary analysis of this case. As a result, the significance of the coverings remains debated. However, it did provide a strong historical accepted indication that the coverings were not placed on by an assassin, but were left by a well-meaning passerby. In the decades following the original inquest, the case went cold, entering into the realm of true crime folklore. However, several alternative hypotheses continued to be proposed by researchers, journalists, and forensic commentators who have looked away from human suspects and looked directly at the geography of the Lane Cove River. One prominent theory suggested that naturally occurring toxic gases, specifically hydrogen sulfate, may have been released under highly specific environmental conditions in the river area on New Year's morning. This hypothesis posited that decades of unregulated industrial waste and organic runoff had formed a thick, toxic sludge at the bottom of the riverbed. Researchers theorized that an extreme low-pressure atmospheric system on January 1, 1963, combined with a total lack of wind, caused the riverbed to erupt, releasing a concentrated, invisible, and completely odorless pocket of hydrogen sulfate gas that pooled in the geographic location where Bogle and Chandler had walked. Inhalation of such a pocket would cause near instantaneous physiological collapse, violent distress, and rapid asphyxiation, matching the 1963 internal autopsy findings and purple skin lesions with incredible precision. The official 1963 coronial inquest officially returned an open finding regarding the cause of death. No individual was charged. No definitive cause was conclusively established. Despite decades of analysis, the deaths of Dr. Gilbert Bogle and Margaret Chandler remain unsolved. Because the original 1963 investigation failed to permanently preserve tissue or blood samples from the autopsies, modern DNA or advanced toxicology testing remains impossible. The material required to solve the case has long since been lost to time. The case continues to be studied through forensic, historical, and criminological perspectives, each attempting to interpret incomplete evidence from a different angle. But the central truth remains unchanged. On New Year's Day, 1963, 2 people were found dead on the banks of the Lane Cove River, and more than 60 years later, the full explanation for their deaths has never conclusively been determined. You've been listening to Criminology Files. Producing these deep dives takes significant time and research. If you find value in our work, please take a moment to subscribe and leave us a review. For case updates and behind-the-scene content, follow us on Instagram at Criminology Files. We'll see you next week. Good night.